I'm going to do a first draft reading of part one of a trilogy, autobiographical trilogy. And I think part two is called Chasing Rainbows. Part three is includes Irish twins. And this is just a draft reading. I've talked about doing it in a genre called faction because I'm still recovering still piecing together some of my earlier memories as a trauma-based mind control MK Ultra survivor in programs, I believe, from birth, even in utero. So the reason I want to call it faction possibly is because there may be the smallest detail here and there that's not accurate, and also, that they may try to sue me. I don't know. Don't care. I've got nothing to sue for, really. But anyway, very low energy today. Sorry about that. This is just a draft reading into the record. I am trying to do a book in writing. A lot of people are telling me that, as good as it is to do video blogs and, social media and everything, it is worth committing to paper, hardback, or even a paperback record or document of what happened to myself and thousands of other survivors, victims. Some didn't make it. My Irish twin didn't make it. So I'll leave this unlisted and maybe share it with a few people for feedback or just to encourage myself to continue. My story begins, to my knowledge, with the grandfathers on both sides of my family, paternal and maternal. The sins of the fathers shall be laid on the sons and daughters unto the third and fourth generation, and beyond, if not accosted. My mother, sisters, and myself were, quote, volunteered by my father into secret and illegal medical experiments post-World War II, and supervised, I believe, by the angel of death, Joseph Mengele himself. My paternal grandfather was Anglo-Welsh. No, that's my maternal grandfather. My maternal grandfather was Anglo-Welsh, an electrician and communications specialist. He unusually spent the entire 4 years of World War I on the front line, repairing and maintaining Morse code communications, vital for intelligence gathering on the, quote, enemy. One of the perks he received for constant frontline duty, which most could only endure for 2 years, was uncensored mail back and forth with family. My mother, 86, still has his letters home, reminiscent of the World War I poet Wilfred Owen, and exhorting his family, us, never to celebrate war as, quote, there is no glory in warfare, only ditches full of blood and gore. That same grandpa lost one of his 3 sons in World War II. My maternal grandpa was in World War I with uncensored mail home, and he lost a son in World War II. My uncle died. His name was Di, the Welsh abbreviation for David, and as a child already with a fascination for words, I felt it ironic that Uncle Di should die. Di had been in the army. Another son was in the Navy, and the third, Uncle Fred, had been in the Royal Air Force, mainly stationed in Canada. I may have got them back to front. Fred might have been in the Navy and Vic in the Air Force. From my research, it would not surprise me if one or all of the sons, my uncles, had also been working for the Secret Services, i.e. British intelligence. The Dupreys were descended from French Huguenot stock, fleeing as Protestants from persecution in France. On my other granddad's side of the family, Tom Power, apparently a simple working man originally from Waterford, research showed that in fact Le Puer or De Puer was a Protestant name and genealogy, tracing back to lords and privy councillors, architects, including of Salisbury Cathedral, and Vikings. Legend has it the Le Puer clan were gifted 10,000 acres and a castle in Carrick-on-Shannon. And when the secretly manufactured famine hit Ireland, it affected the gentry, land stealers, as well as the so-called peasants. All took the boat to Holyhead or Fishguard, eventually intermarrying and forgetting in the struggle to survive who had been rich or poor, who had been Protestant or Catholic. There's a 4-part note of genealogy in which I will insert here in the book, called Poetry in Motion, P-O-E-R, Tree in Motion, written by Frances Mary Power. If you've ever known a pedigree dog or racehorse breeder, you will know the passion with which they seek out new or lost strains of particular bloodlines. They dream of recognizing a lost offspring with unmistakable features, particular conformation, or traits temporarily mislaid because of interbreeding. Much like finding a bastard child of an errant king, breeders seek the Gold Cup winner quietly grazing in a far-off paddock, a star waiting to be born, or reintroduced to fellow savants appreciating the find like a fine wine or cognac, and secretly wishing it was they who had made the discovery. This ancient study of lost bloodlines is a fascination amongst the so-called Illuminati. From the top of the pyramid hierarchy, down through the 13 main families, the 300, the 1,000, and so on. See the many scholarly works written by Fritz Springmeier for background and fascinating detail. I believe my English grandpa's World War I involvement in Morse code and his son's work in intelligence secret services marked my mother as a candidate for, quote, programming, for projects referred to as trauma-based mind control, or the umbrella term MK Ultra, mental control, ultra. My mother was part of the mass child evacuation project, removing children unaccompanied from cities in the UK, especially London, after the infamous Blitz. She was sent away to 2 different distant country cousin families, aged just 5, for most of the 4 years of the war. Trauma indeed. She only got home once for a visit, which was the funeral of her much older brother, Di. Then, as a further step in her MK Ultra program, unawares, she was offered a private school convent scholarship, which her parents agreed to, despite their staunch Protestantism and even racism towards Catholicism, and particularly Irish Catholicism. My mother, alienated and traumatized from the early childhood evacuation, was then pulled from devoted Church of England full participation, including teaching Sunday school, attending church youth groups, and so on, to the gradual drip indoctrination of the Catholic Church of the 1940s. As I set the scene of post-war mind control and social engineering projects and experiments, all secret and without consent, mostly without even knowledge, I hope my readers will bear with me as I write further of what was indeed a helter-skelter, fascinating and terrifying life. Many injuries to my body, soul and mind were secretly inflicted under memory-bending drugs, but strangely the medical assaults and traumas have continued throughout the decades of my life, even until my 50s. I'm 62 as I write this. Clumsy as the writing is, I will attempt to chronicle the injuries I recall in approximate date order. And then I've written a note, insert chronology for MK Ultra victim survivors as so many of the experiments included drugging for memory erasure, and the trauma side of the mind control was deliberate to cause dissociation. So trying to get things in sequence is difficult. In utero. Attempted murder by self-abortion by my mother. I overheard a shocking conversation she had over coffee with a friend and neighbour we called Auntie Phil, where my mother talked of gin and hot baths, knitting needles and tablets from the naffy as she navigated her way through 8 pregnancies in 9 years of her 20s. Only 5 girls, myself included, made it safely through the womb. Although my mother never publicly ascribed the miscarriages to her secret attempted murders, she said rather that the miscarried babies must have been boys, which she mysteriously, quote, couldn't carry. Even my conception, the 3rd pregnancy in as many years, for a delicate, gentle woman, married at 19, instilled dread in my mother's heart. Although with each pregnancy, she hoped she could fulfill my brutish father's desire for a son. So pre-birth, I was greeted first by dread, then assault, and finally, as I entered the world too fast in a rushed delivery, disappointment. Years later, as I studied literature at university, I wrote a haiku. Daddy always wanted a boy. They said 3rd time lucky, but I wasn't. I think my older 2 sisters and I had already been signed up for concentration camp-like experiments even before the conception of myself and my Irish twin Fiona, exactly 11 months older than me to the date and Masonic hour of birth, 3:30 in the morning, the witching hour as it's sometimes called. Mother marveled at the apparent coincidence of the timing and even the same cot in the same ward of the Masonic-styled military hospital built on ley lines with mysterious uses of north, south, east and west. 58 years later, the death of my Irish twin sister, a murder by poison, studiously covered up, was deliberately recorded and repeated as 1330. How those secret societies love their times, their numerology, and their symbolism. And I've made some notes, trying to sort of get towards chronology, hypothermia experiments, horrification, trauma, dislocation, pain, trauma plus electrocution for dissociation, water trauma, drugging for abuse, memory wipe drugs, sexualization, sensory heightening paralysis experiments, otherwise known as sensory deprivation, torture programming from pain to tickling, submission programming, competing programming. In my mother's words, I spent more time in hospital than at home for the first 5 years of my life. According to Mum, I got bronchitis every time I was cutting a tooth, but logic counters that no child is teething for the first 5 years. Other explanations proffered were a chronic disposition to bronchitis, pneumonia, pleurisy, and asthma, later exacerbated by damp living conditions. But my memories, first fractured and fragmented, inexplicable flashbacks of technicolor frozen yet embedded quality, together with research and networking, told me otherwise. Early flashback technicolor frozen memories include the following. Each time I try and launch into chronological documentation of my injuries, I get sidetracked. So I made notes again, surgeries, punctured muscle in my right leg, explained as too many injections in the same place during a life-threatening illness. I'm not sure what it was. Babyhood, as doctors warned I was unlikely to survive, and my father was sent for from Germany. I had a Baker's cyst the size of a golf ball removed from the back of my left leg, behind the knee, an unusual condition in a very young child. I think I was about 8, 9 maybe when that was removed. I was non-verbal for almost my first 3 years. I was apparently taken to a speech therapist who ordered tough love and no requests to be met unless I verbalized them. So apparently I then started talking in full sentences. I suspect I was mute by choice from trauma. 1. Memory starts in the womb, and certain therapists can surface very early memories, certain therapies. I stopped short of hypnotherapy or even formal regression therapy, but I had a sense that my birth had been fast and panicky and may have been a trigger for stress-related asthma and possibly bilateral optic nerve atrophy, although both could be hereditary. I tested my memory by asking my mother, still alive and now 86 years old, and although she often deflects questions about my early years, on this occasion she regaled a story of being at the hairdresser's when her labour became intense. Possibly even her waters broke at the hairdresser's. She was hoping I was a boy to please my father, and she wanted to look her best for the anticipated arrival. She chose to stay until her hair was done, and the delay in getting to the hospital did engender a fast and panicked birth, and a disappointing one for my parents, about which I wrote the haiku. In terms of chronology, I should mention another jigsaw piece discovered later. And I put a note: Fiona always felt an outsider, convinced she was adopted or wanted to be when the gypsies offered to take her. My delicate and cultured English mother converted to Catholicism to marry my father when she was 19 and he was 27. According to doctrine of the 50s, contraception was forbidden, and my mother had 8 pregnancies in 9 years, 3 of which were allegedly miscarriages. Then I duplicated a little bit, talking about, as a young child, maybe 7 or 8, I overheard a shocking conversation Mum was having with a friend for coffee. She thought all of us children were playing outside. At that young age, I did not understand the horror the 2 women were discussing. I sensed it was not for my ears, though, and years later, realization came like a storm cloud or a thunderclap. They were discussing the horrors of a pregnancy every year and the solutions, quote unquote, available. The women were self-aborting. In an off-guard moment years later, Mum admitted to me she had been terrified awaiting the birth of one of my sisters, the 4th that survived, fearing she would be born disabled and it would be her fault. There had been talk of possible spina bifida during Sharon's pregnancy, Mum's pregnancy, but I suspect she had attempted self-abortion on some of us that survived. Mum had proffered a theory that her miscarriages had been boys and that somehow she'd been unable to carry boys. Whether that was whether there was any truth or credibility to that theory, I don't know. The conversation I heard of an English girl despairing at a Catholic annual pregnancy still haunts me. The firstborn child, my oldest sister, was probably a welcome pregnancy. But even with that, my poor mother was traumatized and culture shocked, not just by Irish Catholicism, but an abusive and controlling husband, my father. After celebrating the arrival of his first child, albeit a daughter, he took mother and child, quote, home to Ireland 2 weeks later for a 3-week stay before he was to return to a military posting overseas and wait for housing for his family to join him. In the meantime, he informed my mother, whilst on holiday in Ireland, she was to leave the 5-week-old baby in Ireland with his oldest sister to, quote, mind, and she was to return to her well-paid job in London to keep 2 salaries coming in. I can only imagine the trauma my mother endured having her 5-week-old firstborn baby virtually confiscated in another country. She returned to London childless to a new job in digs with her husband overseas, but it's to her credit that she found other digs that would accept a baby. She found childcare, and she returned to Ireland to reclaim her child. My father accepted reluctantly this brave decision by a naive 21-year-old. But on his next trip back for a weekend with my mother, he persuaded her to leave the baby in the digs and join him at another location where he made her pregnant again. I too was conceived against my mother's will. My father had assured her she would not get pregnant whilst breastfeeding Fiona, and thus created Irish twins. I was born exactly 11 months after the birth of my mother's second child, Fiona, and with the later pregnancies, 2 of which were carried to term, I became the middle child. I'll just refer you to a documentary called 3 Identical Strangers, triplets that were separated at birth. The proximity of birth between myself and my Irish twin, whilst explained in conception by Catholic doctrine and old wives' tales, yet our births both took place in a Masonic purpose-built hospital where Mengele-type experiments were conducted in secret, where the infant mortality rate was inexplicably high, and where, amongst other horrors, an experiment was in place for babies to be swapped at birth, and the mother-child bond tracked and observed to examine how much of the fiery connection was nature and how much nurture. Fiona was born at the dark witching hour of 3:30 a.m. in R.A.F. a catchment hospital for military personnel, both British and American, both Army and Air Force, as well as civilians from the area. It was a location close to the borders of 3 countries, France, Belgium, and Germany. I suspect it sits on leylands and the architecture painstakingly designed by secret societies for the purpose of experimenting in the newly unfolding field of psychiatry and the quest to understand and conquer the workings of the human mind and psyche. A race against the Russians and a mad scientist obsession with conquest of all created by God drove this quest into demonic realms, resulting in mental controller, mind control, MK Ultra. I've written some notes here. I've got a video on my one of my YouTube channels called "I Was Born in R.A.F." And I've put another note: examine also the father-child influence, nature and nurture, especially in father-estranged families. What traits do my children have of their fathers, especially Gabriella, who never lived with him and saw him rarely? Ex-President of the USA, Bill Clinton, acknowledged and apologized for aspects of these experiments, including no consent radiation that took place in America at the hands mostly of Nazi scientists secretly recruited from the concentration camps post-World War II. My story and that of my sisters, especially the older 2, and my mother, is inextricably linked. My firm belief is that my father was recruited early in his military career of 25 years in the British Royal Air Force to participate in secret experiments and volunteer his wife and some, if not all, of his children for them also. Certainly us children gave no consent, nor were able to. My mother may have suspected, but as with the other abuses, including sexual, which we suffered, she either turned a blind eye or she had blind spots through her own ongoing abuse and control at the hands of my psychopathic father. Add to that the umbrella of secret experiments, including extensive periodic electroshock treatment administered to her in both military and secular hospitals, including the Maudsley and Roundway Hospital devices, and the whole web of family abuse and secrecy almost wove itself. In telling the story and putting it in historical context, I put a note to tell myself the details of the baby swap experiment I believe was going on at R.A.F. But if I don't cover it, I'll come back to that. And I said my mother also took the goodies, so I do believe that on some level she was aware that us children were in projects. And we mysteriously had private education paid for, and she, you know, my father mysteriously had far more money and social standing within the military than warranted by his rank. In telling the story and putting it into historical context, I do not want to lose the passion that has me write this, the pain, the emotion, the trauma, the cumulative effect of constant and deliberate what I call horrification, and sometimes referred to as trauma-based mind control. Because my personality was deliberately fractured, it's hard for me to relate some incidents in anything but a clinical manner. Recapturing the memories and piecing them together in approximate chronology before they float away again into an intended sea of forgetfulness. Hopefully, good editing will add a flow to stilted, stuttering memory recall, or my readers will understand to some degree the nature of breaking a person's psyche and personality for the purpose of research and domination of the mythical Russians, or whoever the perceived enemy or competitor or bogeyman of the era might be. For whatever reason, breaking down, understandably, and manipulating the human mind, both conscious and unconscious, became an obsession alongside the so-called science of psychiatry. Different reasons coagulated into a pool of justification for a quest to be God, and not only understand the miracle of the human brain, but conquer it, for purposes some supposedly good, but mostly evil. Soldiers returning, the quote fortunate ones from world wars, were suffering from what was commonly called shell shock, and now is referred to as post-traumatic stress disorder. It was poor advertising for the lucrative business of warfare, and also poor human resource management if a quote cure was not found. There were other sinister experiments to test the boundaries of human endurance, including testing the point of death from hypothermia. On a deeper level, there was a race to create the perfect spy, one who could not crack under enemy torture and interrogation, one or thousands or millions, who could be sent on assignments and complete them and then be effectively memory wiped, so it would seem as if they were never on assignment. Early and consistent profound trauma, ideally from birth to 7 years, could induce fracturing of the mind and personality, the psyche, and is referred to as dissociation, previously known as multiple personality disorder. The brain is still forming and brain pathways can be diverted in this developmental stage, which had the Jesuits coin the phrase, quote, "Give me the child till they're 7 years old and I'll give you the man." This early trauma window can be stretched to 12 years, and whilst most people might only access 10% of the conscious mind, with the other 90% being the hugely powerful subconscious, diverting brain pathways is similar to autism in that it can give access, cause access to high giftings such as photographic memory, total recall, so-called psychic ability, mathematical genius, multilingual ability, and so on. I put a couple of notes there, mind and personality fracturing. Refer to the film or book Sybil, although that's rather dramatized from my perspective. Refer to boarding schools and the Kundalini activation through sodomy, particularly in the British public school education system, where the boys were sent away at 8 to boarding school and ritually sodomized as part of the pecking order, as part of normal boarding school life at public schools. And one of the theories and one of the justifications for doing that was that it would send shock waves that would travel up the spine to the cortex of the brain, activating Kundalini, activating the genius factor, if you like. This is why so many sodomized and brutalized youngsters end up being prime ministers or politicians or excelling in their fields, whatever their field might be. You look at so many, you know, that past Bullingdon boys or, you know, already cross-dressers, already paedophiles. Little known fact about Winston Churchill was a peer colleague of his said the man's a genius if he would just stop buggering little boys. And you know, Tony Blair, ex-British Prime Minister, was a cross-dresser at university and called Miranda, and prosecuted twice for soliciting young boys in public toilets in London. It's almost easier to find, even today, most politicians and people in positions of power and influence, particularly in the UK, have almost all been sodomized ritually in boarding school as part of their, and some of them in satanic ritual abuse rings. I refer you to Stephen George, a victim of Jimmy Savile, but also of her father, an MP, and a paedophile ring, and many, many survivors. Carl Beach, I still maintain, you know, told a lot of truth. His stepfather was the head of British Intelligence Services, MI6. So it was a secret society ritual to have particularly their boys traumatized and sodomized before the age of 12, as early as possible. One of the justifications being to activate that brain pathway diversion. And there's a doctor, he's dead now, Dr. Paul Hegstrom, Hegstrom, who's done a lot of research on brain pathways, including, you know, medical proof. You know, Dr. Paul Hegstrom, look up his work. It's very good. Okay, so yeah, access to high giftings. Yeah, I said so, photographic memory, psychic ability, mathematical genius, artistic genius, multilingual abilities, and so on. As well as trauma to the point of near death and often crossing the point of no return. A walk around the hospital graveyard in R.A.F. Vegberg tells the sad story of high infant mortality rates. And those are just the deaths recorded in those dark early days of post-war experiments. My Irish father, one of 16 children, with 5 having died in infancy or toddlerhood, served 25 years in the British Royal Air Force from 1945 until early in 1971. The first 12 years of my life were as a military child, and unsurprisingly, no medical records have been available. I finally reported my multiple abuses from birth to British police in 2016, who conducted a 6-month investigation, including liaising with an Air Force sergeant allocated specifically to issues such as sexual abuse within the military. I believe a full paedophile ring was operating within the Air Force, and I have horrific flashback memories I will go into later of it. Sadly, the liaison sergeant would not access my medical records, or could not, despite pressure from the detectives handling the investigation from 2 police forces, Wiltshire and Avon and Somerset. They demanded my records using first a military ombudsman and then the UK ombudsman, but to no avail. All that was released was my father's postings over 25 years, with some details. I've shared them in the video evidence, with just an allusion to him being granted an inordinate amount of, quote, sick leave. Some of his postings, recounted by my mother and corroborated by research, did not appear on the scant history given by the Air Force, and none of the so-called, quote, secondments, including to magnificent yachts anchored off of Gibraltar and hosting shadowy royals and heads of state, including Ian Smith of South Africa and Harold Wilson of the UK. None of these were recorded either. It is my firm belief the so-called secondments were in fact sinister attendants at paedophile gatherings and rituals, including human hunting. For those who don't know, human hunting is where sadistic, satanic elites will strip and release young children and tell them to run for their lives, and then hunt them, often with dogs and sometimes on horseback. The children, when caught, will be in a state of absolute terror and exhaustion. I have memories of this. And some will be simply raped, and others will be raped and murdered. Satanic ritual abuse is well documented amongst the so-called elite and used for multiple dark purposes. Practicing Satanists actually do access demonic powers through rituals and sacrifices. Secret societies like the Freemasons, the Knights of Malta and Columbus, etc., advance through the higher degrees and ranks by participating in increasingly complex and diabolical practices, good for enforced loyalty through blackmail and collusion. And some attendees are just straight up perverts. And pedophiles too kind of word to use, that just means a lover of children. These are child rapists, child murderers, child cannibals. The main training camp for the British Royal Air Force is on land, quote, gifted by the Rothschilds, well known and infamous for hosting, funding and participating in satanic ritual abuse parties. That entire stately home and land was eventually, I believe it's R.A.F. Halton, was eventually handed over to the Royal Air Force, whether through blackmail, compromise or pure philanthropy. Only a few would know. My research showed originally, I think it was 100 acres of the estate at Halton was gifted to the Royal Air Force. I think it was in World War I. And then eventually the entire estate was handed over to them. A small part of it now operates as an exclusive hotel and wedding venue. This was a long preamble and context setting to the haunting flashbacks and fractured memories of my early life. This book is part one of a trilogy, Chasing Rainbows. Part two is written both in DVD form of the same name and draft written form as a collection of short stories and poetry, etc. Part three will cover the tragic death of my Irish twin sister when she was 58. And hopefully the beginning of a new phase of my life, the twilight years, the walking in the healing, such as it is, and specifically recovery from addiction, in my case, progressive alcoholism. I will also cover in part three my return to full-time work online in 2015, and the orchestrated, organized, professional attacks on myself and other whistleblowers trying to expose paedophile rings, satanic ritual abuse, and MKUltra. Post-war mind control experiments, character assassinations, smear campaigns, trolling and bullying to a dark and professional level, and supported and endorsed at the highest ranks by people either implicated or compromised. Even a trilogy and the most patient of readers or researchers will not cover all of my life. 49 homes in 7 countries on 3 continents, 11 proposals of marriage, a few engagements, a green card marriage, an orchestrated bloodline marriage for breeding purposes. I'm multilingual, chameleon-like to extreme. I have an ability to audio snapshot conversations and reproduce them verbatim in dramatic form. I believe I was subject not only to what Kathy Morgan and I coined ladyfication, which is, it's a programming, at the hands of cooperating, complicit, Jesuit-influenced nuns, but to multiple other hypnosis-type programming, including sex kitten programming. People ask me sometimes why I fawn on camera. It's just programmed. Off camera, on camera. Always useful for an unaware spy on assignment to double up as a honeypot. Again, I venture into recording fragments of memories, particularly from the first 8 to 12 years of my life, the hidden years, after hidden, often even from myself. Subheadings, themes, I have no idea how best to chronicle the trauma. I firmly believe myself and thousands of others like me were never meant to chronicle, to disclose, or to remember, let alone join the dots, network with each other, research and track down project names, goals, purposes, or side effects. The very act of remembering is an act of mutiny, a breaking of programs, a failure of the experiments to successfully and permanently memory wipe the human mind with no trace or evidence. P and CBT connection under the same umbrella. Kathy O'Brien, author of Transformation of America and Access Denied, talks of the intended maximum lifespan of a trauma-based mind control slave, an MK Ultra subject or asset, was 30 years. That was the age when the programming, and specifically the enforced dissociation and compartmentalized memory wiping, could start to break down, with flashbacks starting to bleed through from the subconscious to the conscious mind. Many died in mysterious circumstances coming up to their 30th birthday. I wonder even if the many celebrities whose sudden deaths gave them entry to the, quote, 27 Club, such as Amy Winehouse, were part of the dead before 30 group of MK Ultra victims. No more context setting or background, let me write my fragments. I've spoken many in video form. See my blog, angelascaches.org. So I'll leave that there. That's what I've written so far. In part 1, I've written part 2, and it's up in manuscript form waiting for a publisher. And so if there are any publishers out there that want to help me put this in writing, that would be great. Thanks very much. angelascaches.org, Angela Power Disney on YouTube, or my smaller channel, Angie Power Disney on YouTube. Thanks for listening. You can contact me, angelapowerdisney@gmail.com.